Hey adventurers, so today's going to be a different video than I think I've ever done before. And that's kind of cool. I like having these new ideas of videos, and this is one that maybe I've seen other people do it before, probably have, but the idea came to me and I was like, I like that idea and I think that I have some options for this. And so what I'm going to do is easy entry series, or these are series that I feel have a very low barrier for entry, and so pretty much anybody can read them, and I think that they'll enjoy them and get something. These are books that have functionally no barrier to entry. They're easy to get into and to understand, and you don't need to be well read in the genre to enjoy them. Oftentimes, book one works really well as a standalone. Maybe it's not a huge commitment for the series as a whole, or the series is not daunting. That could be for something like it's a trilogy rather than a 14 book Wheel of Time series, something like that. And so there's various different reasons why this could be, and I'll talk about them as I go through this series, through the books that I'm talking about here. And yeah, let's actually get into this list. I have 10 on this list here, but I have other lists. If people really like this and think that they want to hear more of the options that I have, I've kind of split these up into, like, these are just this first 10 that I have. They are all fantasy, I believe. Yes, they're all fantasy series from various genres across the fantasy spectrum, mostly. And I think that they're just really good examples of easy entry series. But I've got some other ones that are different mixtures of this same idea and have a little bit different takes on how I would approach them. So if people want to hear more about more of these series series that I feel like have a low barrier for entry, let me know and I will do some more videos on this, because it's easy for me to. I already have another 20 of them listed out and separated out, so it would be easy for me to make at least 2 more videos on this. I'm hoping to get through this fairly quickly because my throat is going and I've got to continue doing other things today yet. But the first one that I have is Mistborn. Of course, Mistborn is going to be on here by Brandon Sanderson. Everybody who has read this series says, yeah, this is a super easy series to get into. It's not daunting, it's not difficult, and it's very fun. The reason why I say, even though it's a fairly large, it's 643 pages in the mass market paperback here. I don't know if this isn't even the mass market paperback, but in this edition, it is like 640 pages long, which is a little lengthy for somebody brand new to fantasy, but they read so quickly, and Sanderson is a very accessible writer in his writing style. You can just sit down and blow through a good chunk of this book very quickly within one sitting. And they read really quickly. They're very easy to understand. He doesn't hold your hand, but he clearly walks you through what's going on, and it's not hard to get into at all. This is actually still my favorite of Sanderson's series that I've read. I haven't read every single one of his books yet, but this is the one that I feel like, and most people tend to say, this is the best entry into Sanderson's works. And it's also a good entry into the, it's a good bridge series between like middle grade or young adult fantasy into this more adult fantasy. And so I think it's just a general all-around good suggestion, and that's why I put it first on here, because I want to get it out of the way. The rest of these are really in no particular order, but I want to go through them anyway. So the next one I have is A Natural History of Dragons, or the Memoirs of Lady Trent series. And there's 5 books in this series, so it's not a huge commitment. It's a little bit longer than a trilogy, but the books are fairly short. This is like a 350-page book. So they're fairly short books, but they're easy to read. It's a very different flavor of fantasy. It's technically high fantasy in that it's set in a secondary world, or secondary world fantasy if you want to call it that, but it is very familiar. It's set in like a Victorian era type setting, and it's about a gal who wants to study dragons. And so it's a memoir of this gal's adventures, this lady Trent's adventures, and each of the 5 books chronicles a different adventure that she goes on. In this first one, it's just they go to basically like a little Russian town, and study dragons there. And it's really fun. It's really lighthearted. There's not something super terrifying about this series. It's not daunting at all, and it's just an easy book to just sit down and read and enjoy. It may not be for everyone, but those are the people who I've talked to that have read this have just been like, this is just a great series. It's just so nice and so much fun. It is, I don't think I would classify it as cozy fantasy, but it is to some degree. It's because of the way that it approaches it. It's just a very easy, you go in and you sit down and you read this book about a gal who's going to study dragons and what she has to go through in order to get herself to the point where she's a respected dragon naturalist. And so yeah, it's just a memoir type book. It's her telling her story, and that's really fun. The next one I have is The Rune Lords by David Farland. This is a little bit different because it is a massive epic fantasy series. This is a 9-book series. Only books 1 through 8 are out because book 9 was not completed before the author passed away, and so we haven't been able to read book 9. However, book 1 functions as a standalone really well, and so you can read it. It's like 600, no, less than that. It's like 500 pages, 470, almost 480 pages is all. So it's a fairly short book for epic fantasy, and it just immerses you in this world. It's a brutal world for sure, but it's also very accessible, very easy to read this story, easy to understand what's going on, although you do have questions, and they're questions that are being asked in the series, and so it's okay for the reader to have them as well because you're supposed to. But it's very classic fantasy in a lot of ways. David Farland is a very talented writer. He's one of those writers that, like the writers that you know and have heard of, they all learn from him type thing. And so he's a great author to read to understand the fantasy genre even to some degree. But this Rune Lord series, the whole thing is fairly good. It is good and is fairly easy and accessible, but the first book especially, because it can function as a standalone. The other thing that makes this nice and accessible and low barrier to entry is it's free on Audible. All 8 books, I believe, are still free on Audible, which makes it great for anybody who has an Audible account just to go listen to the books, and especially the first book. And if, of course, any of these series that I'm talking about, if you read the first one and you don't like it, you don't have to commit to the rest of the series. And that's a great thing about them. I'm trying really hard not to include series on this list that the rest of the series would be required reading even if you don't like the first book, you feel like you have to continue reading. I don't want that to be the case with any of these books. And so that's not what I'm doing with them. There may be one that leans into that a little bit more than normal. But anyway, so yeah, I feel like Rune Lords is another good option of this. The next one is a series that I don't have any physical books, and I actually have decided to DNF this series, which is a good example of what I'm saying here, is that you don't feel like you need to read the rest of the series. And this is The Dresden Files by Jim Butcher. So the first book, I believe, is Stormfront. And even though I was never like blown away with this series, this is what I guess let's talk about what this series is. So it's a series about a magical wizard. He's a wizard he's like a wizard detective in Chicago. And so he is studying magical crimes, things that happen with magic in Chicago, in the city of Chicago, working with the police department and stuff like that to solve these crimes. And that's kind of fun. So this is what's considered, as most people know, it's considered urban fantasy, meaning it's set in like an urban setting. Like, it's one of the most well-known examples of urban fantasy, probably considered by most people to be one of the best examples as well. And this series, I enjoyed book 1 enough to want to continue on, and so I listened to book 2 and I wasn't feeling it, and I listened to book 3 and I wasn't feeling it, and at that point, I believe I listened to book 3 even. At that point, I decided I didn't want to continue with this series. But the first book was very easy to get into, very easy to listen to. I listened to them on audiobook because that's a lot easier for me, and I make more progress on audiobook than I do on physical book. So I listened to it on audio, and I enjoyed it well enough to want to continue at that point, and I liked some of the things that were going on. I liked, for the most part, the character of Harry. I liked the surrounding world. I liked the way that I liked Jim Butcher's writing style. All these things that just made it really easy for me to get into and enjoy book 1. And even if I hadn't, I would still say, yeah, this is an easy... There's very low barrier for entry on this series. You can just read the first book and decide from there. They're not terribly long books. I want to say it's again like around 400 pages for Stormfront, and so it's very easy to get into. The thing that makes it daunting is the fact that there are like 17 books in the series at this point. That's what makes it daunting. However, if you just read the first book, you can read it as a standalone. Each of these books are very standalone in nature, I believe, until you get further into the series where it starts branching out and becoming more epic. But to start with, at least, the first 3 books were all books that could be considered standalone stories. Books 2 and 3, of course, do reference events that happened in the past in books 1 and 2 and stuff like that. But you could read the series and just read the first book and decide, okay, that was fine, I'm done. Kind of like I did. I waited until book 3 to do that, but still, it absolutely is an acceptable thing to do. But I think that it has a low barrier to entry. It's one that pretty much anybody could pick up and read, and they wouldn't have a hard time reading the book, getting into the book. Along those same lines is the Unbreakable trilogy by J.R. Carroll. I actually don't have any of the books in the Unbreakable trilogy. However, I do have one in his More Than Human universe, and that's so the Unbreakable trilogy is set in this More Than Human universe, and I'm kind of talking about the universe as a whole, not just the Unbreakable trilogy. However, the Unbreakable trilogy, absolutely the first one, which is More Than a Vampire, is absolutely a book that it's very easy to get into. It's a urban fantasy, although it's a little bit more. It's set in the past. It's not modern, and so it's a little bit of like historical urban fantasy type thing, which is kind of cool. Mythological. It plays with a lot of mythological themes, and so this series, I feel like, is a good, like, easy to get into. It's a self-published series. I will mention that. I do have More Than a Gunslinger, which is one of the books in the universe, the More Than Human novel, and I think that you can start with either of these, and that's a great place to start, whether More Than a Gunslinger or More Than a Vampire. And I think that's part of what makes this series, this More Than a Human universe, have such a low barrier to entry, because you have these 2 starting points that are pretty different, but also they give you a good taste. You can read either one and say, I understand how this author is going to write. I understand the storytelling style that he uses. And I feel like either of them are just good options for starting with this world and series. More Than a Gunslinger is a standalone, which that automatically helps. More Than a Vampire is the first book in a trilogy, so that helps. It's a short series. You don't have to commit to something massive in order to understand them. Plus, the books are not that long. This one is, come on, give me the page number, 270 pages. So it's a fairly short book, fairly short fantasy book. And the Unbreakable trilogy is not that much longer either. And so it's very easy to get into these books. They do have audiobooks, and so different options for how you read them as well. And yeah, I just think this is another good option along with Dresden Files for urban fantasy. Then I have Becoming a Druid by Mike Mohlman. This is another self-published fantasy series. This is the Protectors of Brittany. So this is the first book in the series. And again, another one where it's just easy to get into. The author is not a difficult writer to read. Like, you can understand the story that he's going with. It's a very fun story. It's just enjoyable. It's very enjoyable for you to go through and read this first book especially, and just learn about this druidic culture that's based on our own druid cultures from the past, and it's set in a fantasy version of the British Isles, essentially. It's the British Isles before they're the British Isles type thing. But it's just another one that's got a low barrier to entry. It's very easy just to pick up this first book and read it, or listen to the audiobook. I think the narrator for the audiobook is fantastic. And so, yeah, just really easy to read, really fun to read. There's 3 other books in the series out, and Mike Mohlman is writing even more and continuing through the series. I think he's got 7 books planned for the series, or 8 books, I don't remember. But they're good. Book 2 is a short story collection. There's some short stories or novellas or novelettes or whatever that are combined into book 2, which is titled Sins and Sorrows. But book 1 acts in many ways as a standalone book, and you can read it in that way. And I think it's a great idea to start the series with book 1 being essentially a standalone, so that people can get invested in the book and at that point decide, yeah, I want to continue, or you know what, I think book one was good enough for me and I can move on. And I think that's a great way for authors to write series. And so that's, and you'll notice the same theme. All of these books that I've talked about have been good standalone books. You can read them as standalones. All right, the next one that I have is the Threadlight series. Book one is titled Voice of War. It's a trilogy, so that makes it short. The total length of the trilogy is about 850 pages. The entire trilogy is about 827 pages, so it's fairly short. It's not a terribly lengthy trilogy to begin with, and being a trilogy, that's a lot easier to get into than a massive multi-book series. But book one is a good, it's a little bit less of a standalone because it leaves you in a place where you can leave it there. You can, absolutely. There was a long time between my reading of Voice of War and then continuing with the rest of the two books in the series, or actually restarting Voice of War and continuing through. But I felt satisfied with the ending of what was going on there, and I wanted to continue, but I didn't need to continue immediately. And so this is kind of one of the ones that breaks my rule for standaloneness, but even with that, it still does a good job at, you can get to the end of the book and say, I don't need to read more, or say, yeah, I want to read more. And it's very easy to make that decision once you're there. It's, again, another one that's really easy to read, very easy to understand the magic. It's a high fantasy, epic fantasy. A lot of people consider it to be Sanderson light, in that he approaches magic and world building in the same way that Sanderson does, but not in so much intricate detail. And I think that makes it very accessible. He has a very accessible writing style, a little bit more colorful, a little bit more pretty than Sanderson's is, but that's a good thing, because you don't want authors to be exactly the same. And so he has his own flavor for sure, and it's very different from Sanderson. I'm not trying to say that he is Sanderson, but there's a lot of good stuff with this book, this first book especially. I actually really liked it. Book two is my favorite of the series, but I like book one, and I like what the mini themes that Argyle is playing with. And so I think it's another good option, even though it does kind of lead you directly into book two, and you kind of do have to continue on with book two. But that's kind of the only one that really follows that really breaks that rule of it being a standalone of these books that I have. But I still feel like it works well as a first book, and it's got a low barrier to entry. You can just go read the first book and decide at that point what you want to do, and you will understand what you're reading without too much effort. The next one I have is another epic fantasy series, and that is The Legends of the First Empire, or Age of Myth, is book one. I am currently, actually at the time of recording this video, I am currently listening to book 3 in the series, I believe, which is Age of War. Yes. So book one is Age of Myth, book two Age of Swords, and book three is Age of War. This is another very easy series to get into. It's about 450 pages, and so it's not a massive commitment either to read the first book. The series as a whole, I believe, is 5 or 6 books long, so it's a little bit more of a commitment to read it, but the books themselves read very easily. The audiobooks are narrated by a good narrator, and so it's easy to get into them if you're approaching them as a reader, which I did listen to the books. I did listen to the audiobooks, and so I can't say that I physically read them, but the way that they're written, I've listened to enough audiobooks now that I can tell when a book is going to be easy to read or not, based off of how it's essentially the sentences that are being written. And so I can tell you that, yeah, it's a fairly easy book to get into. This is one that is not a favorite series of mine, but I do think it's an easy entry point. You can read this first book and you can read it and say, okay, I'm good. I don't really care if I continue with the next book. That's actually what happened with me mostly, is I got to the end of book one and said, I'm not going to listen to book two right now. And so I eventually came back and listened to book two, but it wasn't immediate, and I didn't feel the need for it to be immediate. This is kind of a little bit like a prehistoric fantasy to some degree. It's before written history started being written. And it's high fantasy. It's not set on Earth, but it's set in an interesting timeline. The biggest thing that I kind of dislike about this series is that it feels a little bit like a prequel, because it is a prequel. This series is the prequel to, I can't remember what the other series is, but there's another series, the Rhyria Revelations. So and the Rhyria Chronicles. I have no idea how to pronounce that name. So there's two other series in this world, and this is a prequel to those series. And I feel like it feels like a prequel. I have never read a book that feels so much like a prequel other than Age of Myth. Like, this feels more like a prequel than it does its own story, and that's very interesting. I don't hate it, but I feel like because of that, my enjoyment is actually taken down a notch. But that's personal opinion, and I don't argue with the fact that I actually do believe that it is a good entry, an easy place to enter into this series, into this world, that you can read the book without too much difficulty, and that you won't have too much difficulty understanding it. There's actually a lot of stuff that I do really like in it. It's got a lot of classic fantasy tropes and creatures and stuff like that. So, like, it's not going to feel unfamiliar to you to read this series. I feel like that's a positive about this series. I've got to finish this up because I'm losing my voice here. But the next one I have is the Winter Night Trilogy by Catherine Arden. So I've only read the first book in this series, and I don't feel the need to continue on immediately, which is exactly what we're looking for with this list. The first book is titled The Bear and the Nightingale, and I don't have a review for it up yet. I don't, by the time you're watching this, I might. I don't know. I do have it filmed, and not edited, but I do have it filmed. Anyways, The Bear and the Nightingale is a standalone, like, it acts as a standalone, and then the series continues on afterwards. I think it's a trilogy. I don't know exactly how many pages this would be. I think it's around the 450 to 500 page mark again, so fairly standard for fantasy, actually. But this is, The Bear and the Nightingale is set in Russia, in a little village in Russia, and it's about a town, this village, trying to survive winter and trying to survive the onset of this terrible, terrible winter that's coming. And this one girl who is trying to save her village. And there's a lot of things that's it's very Russian in many ways. It's very mythological, plays with a lot of mythology, creatures and tropes and stuff like that, and ideas from the Russian culture. It brings in a lot of that, the cultural side of things. It plays a lot with winter. Just a lot of really nice, I enjoyed the setting of this book immensely, and I feel like it's very easy to get into. It's very prettily written, not the most flowery prose you'll ever read, but it's good enough so that it helps you to immerse yourself in the world that's being written about. And yeah, I think that it's another good option for a standalone book, and that's set in a series. The first book was written, I believe, I'm not positive about this, but I believe when it was first written, the author intended it to be a standalone, but then it had such a good reception, and the author had ideas for more stories that the author wrote more stories in the series or something like that. I'm not entirely positive about that, but I do know that the first book acts as a standalone because I've read the first book and it acts as a standalone. You can read it as a standalone and it's enjoyable in that way. So then the last one that I have is the Earthsea Cycle. The first book in the Earthsea Cycle is A Wizard of Earthsea. This is by Ursula K. Le Guin. So this is another classic fantasy story, and one that I think really is different. It's about a mage who unleashes evil upon the world and has to deal with it. It's a coming of age story for sure. So you get a lot of the same tropes from the coming of age stories, and I feel like it works really well. You learn a lot about this world. It's a very unique world. It's set in an archipelago. It's a whole bunch of islands. There's I don't even know if it's an archipelago because there's not a mainland, but it's a whole bunch of islands. So it's a world that's Earthsea is just a planet of islands surrounded by water. That's what an island is. And so the character is going back and forth between various islands, and his adventure takes him to all these various different islands, and he's learning magic, and he's learning about the world, and he's learning about himself. And the first book, A Wizard of Earthsea, is amazing. It's very you immerse yourself in this story being told. And one of the strengths of this series is that it's not just action. It's centered around this character's journey, and it's so very theme heavy, this whole series. It's very contemplative, very thoughtful in the way that it approaches storytelling, and I really appreciated that but it's also just a great story. Like, you read the story and it's very enjoyable for what it is, and for the difference that it is. It's very different from the other fantasies. It's, yes, it's an adventure, but it's not adventure in that it's, oh, we're gonna go do this thing and have a lot of fun and we're gonna kill a bunch of orcs along the way or anything like that. It's the journey is so much about the character rather than the events. And A Wizard of Earthsea, I think, is a really good single book on its own. And in fact, this whole series, yes, the other books in the series build upon what came before, but each book is actually very individual. It tells its own individual story. There's usually a time jump in between the books. Between book 1 and 2 is like 15 years or something like that. And so, or more maybe, I don't remember. But you've got this time that you can read the first book and be like, okay, that was nice. And then if you ever come back to the next book, it feels like, it doesn't feel like you've forgotten things, because the story has moved on and progressed, and then what's needed from book 1 comes back in book 2. And I feel like it's another good standalone fantasy story that's also part of a series, the first book in a series, and it works really well in that way. And I think that it's just a good book. So anyways, I have talked way too long about all these series. I think that the idea that I had for this is cool. Unfortunately, I think that I rambled, and that's not cool. So anyways, I'm going to close it out here. Thank you guys for watching an Erudite Adventure. Please like, comment, and subscribe if you like what you're seeing from an Erudite Adventure, and we will see you guys again soon. Let me also know if you want to see more of this type of video, because I have at least 2 more that I can do very easily. Anyways, thank you guys for watching. We will see you guys again soon. Stay warm.